fact that they did attack us. I mean, you've got to see it in that context. Now, you argue that facing up to this attack, our people committed two grave atrocities. Number one, the Deir Yassin incident.
Yeah.
Number two, driving out Arabs and turning them into refugees.
Yeah.
And now, before I deal with these 2 points, and I will in a moment, very central to your thesis is that the Nazi impact of persecution on the Jewish people brought them to do such atrocities. And you've mentioned the British action in bombing civilians in Port Said in 1956. Now, Professor, in Volume 4, page 128F of your study of history, you say that in the history of man's attempt at civilization hitherto, there has never been any society whose progress in civilization has gone so far that in times of revolution or war its members could be relied upon not to commit atrocities. And you quote here, this was written before World War II, behaviour of the German army in Belgium in 1914, the British Black and Tans in Ireland in 1920, the French army in Syria, German National Socialist stormtroops at home in 1933 before World War II, and the Italian black shirts. Am I correct, sir, in assuming that you feel that this is in a record down history? Now, you said that because of the bombing of Britain by the Germans, a certain state of mind, some impact, some scar developed in the British consciousness, and that reflected itself in the bombing of Port Said. Now, the Black and Tans in Ireland was 1920, well over 13 years before Hitler came to power. And there are many such incidents I could recall. You could even take during World War II, British bombing of Berlin.
Yes, definitely.
Now, would you agree with me that all these instances have an element of cruelty, which is quite comprehensive in your terms, whether it be the bombing of Berlin in World War II, whether it be earlier the Black and Tans, whether it be Hiroshima, whether it be even the treatment of the early American Indians. Right through this you feel that there is a sense of atrocity. Now, how do you relate all this to Nazism? Secondly, you agree that there were also Arab massacres of Jewish civilians. I can give you details. If you will come to Israel, I will show you their graves in frightening cruelty. And long before Deir Yassin, to which I'll refer in a minute. Were these also in the category of Nazi atrocities? And if so, why don't you say that both sides did things in such a category? Why do you choose us? Why do you single us out? Why don't you write of Britain and of almost every country in the world according to your own definition? And finally, a word in Deir Yassin. I suggest in refugees we'll talk it later as a separate part. But in Deir Yassin I would say this. Deir Yassin took place after a series of massacres, such as the destruction of 50 Jewish labourers in Haifa in December 1947, convoy after convoy, the well-known convoy to Yechiam, in which we lost 40 people, the blowing up of Ben Yehuda, 50 people killed in Jerusalem, 70 wounded, under enormous provocation. It was a city under siege. In your own survey of international studies, written by Dr. Kirk under your editorship, he quotes the commander of the Irgun at the time as having said that his men suffered heavy casualty, appreciable casualties, and those responsible for that action have claimed that the Arab residents of the village were warned to leave the houses, and that this tragedy developed through hand-to-hand fighting, and indeed the commander of the operation was killed. But I would add, be that as it may, this action was condemned in most vigorous terms by the Jewish agency of the time, and a message of regret was sent to King Abdullah of Jordan. We heard no such expressions of regret for Arab massacres, although they were undertaken within the category of armed offensive against us. So to sum up, sir, what I would ask you, do you agree that there is a line linking every act of atrocity committed by soldiers in various countries and down the ages? If so, would you agree that this odium of a Nazi impact would be attached to all such nations, not only to Israel, including to the Arabs, for what they did to us, particularly since they attacked us and we were operating as self-defense? And on Deir Yassin and the refugee matter, we'll talk it later.
Yes. Well, I suppose the Arabs could match atrocity. You, Mr. Ambassador, gave a short list, you could give many more instances of Arab massacres of Jews, and they could give many, I suppose, of...
By the way, sir, if I may just interrupt you, at the end of the first week after the November 29th resolution, 105 Jews were killed and many were injured. In 1 week, right after resolution in December 1947. This is on record.
But there were things on both sides. Now, about my own country, as you say, in a volume published between the wars, I did mention things my own country had done of this kind. And if I'd not published this volume 2 years before the aggression against Egypt, I would certainly have mentioned my country's aggression in this context. I couldn't because I published in 54 and the thing happened in 56. It was a thing which the Indians call karma, which is the chain of moral evil. It's a generalization of what I tried to suggest before, that it's something in human nature which makes us pass on to against other people the evil that has been done to us. And I agree with the ambassador that this is a very general and a very horrible thing in human life. But I also feel very strongly that, as the Buddha felt when he emphasized this chain of karma, that that is not an excuse. We can't just say, oh, this is part of human nature, everybody does it or has done it at some time, therefore we can all get away with it and mutually, so to speak, condone what each of us does. We have to break this chain. Now, coming back to the Israel case, I know very well that there are many people, no doubt a majority in Israel, who were horrified at those massacres done by some Israeli armed forces. And the Israelis are a rather small minority of the people of Jewish religion in the world. And I'm sure that the majority of Jews in the world, as far as they knew about this, were also horrified. And their responsibility, one has a slight responsibility for anyone's co-religionists do. I feel a slight responsibility for what my Protestant Christian co-religions of European race are doing at this moment in South Africa, and a much greater one for what my English Protestant co-religionists are doing in Rhodesia and, say, Kenya. But these degrees of responsibility are limited. I would make the point that all Israel has implicated itself, so to speak, in the results of that flight, partly expulsion, to a smaller extent massacre of the Palestinian Arabs, because they have taken and held the land and the property which is legally and rightfully still that of the Arabs. Now, putting it bluntly, this is robbery, and I'm sure it is on the Jewish conscience. And this is a continuing thing which has to be cleared up, first of all, by the Jews themselves, primarily the Israelis, but it also does concern all Jewish communities all over the world who make Israel's existence possible by their financial and also by their political support. Particularly the Canadians and United States citizens who are Jews by religion, who have the greatest financial power and the strongest political say in this matter. So we have this continuing question of how to break the chain of karma, how to prevent the wrong that has been done, which was bred, I agree, by previous wrongs, from breeding further wrongs in its turn. I have been in the refugee camps in the Gaza Strip, and I've heard the songs that the children sing in their schools. If you wanted to see what it was like to be a Jew, say 13 or 14 years after Nebuchadnezzar exiled the Jews, go to the Gaza Strip and you will study the spirit and state of mind of the Arabs there. They're saying just the same things, feeling the same things that the Jews felt then, have continued to feel later. This was our country. We mean to return.
Professor?
Please. Yes.
Well, pardon me if I come back to the original issue. I said yes. Again, I'll deal with the refugee matter in a minute. Yes. But the original issue was a question of comparing what we did morally to what the Nazis did to us. Now, I think it's been established that there was a war of aggression against us. I've given some background to the Deir Yassin massacre. I will deal later with the refugee matter. But from what I understand from the quotation I gave and from what you've now elaborated, would you agree, Professor, that this stigma of comparison, of moral comparison, applies not only to our people, but to those Arabs who were responsible for massacres, the ones I detailed, and many more I can give you lists, to most of the nations of the world who at any time, their soldiers in war, even in self-defense, have been guilty of atrocity?
I would distinguish sharply, though this is difficult, but this is one of the necessary and valuable conventions of human society between suffering, death, mutilation caused in fighting between organized and uniformed armed forces, and massacres by people of civilians behind the front.
Accepted. I'm referring any instances in history, and when you talk here of atrocity, you do not mean act between the combatants. You mean atrocities committed by military people against civilians.
Yes.
And you've quoted certain allegations against us, which I'll deal with separately. But suppose from your standpoint, the extreme standpoint, and so our propaganda claims, that we were guilty of the atrocity in that form. But do you admit, sir, that the similar guilt attaches to nearly every country in the world? For at some time or other, as you yourself have said in your quote, no society, its members can be relied on not to commit atrocities in time of war revolution. And again, I say, even if it's in self-defense.
I agree that most societies have committed atrocities, but I do not think that condones atrocities.
I didn't say so, sir.
No.
I agree with you on that. But I mean, you do agree that this same element, this comparison, can be applied on a universal level to any country which in war its soldiers have committed atrocities against civilians.
Yes, atrocities are atrocities, and murder is murder, whoever commits it.
And that would apply also, sir, in case of Arab atrocities against Jewish civilian population?
Well, of course.
Yes, and the Black and Tans,
of course,
for the United States,
yes,
early Indians,
yes.
Whole ream is limitless. In other words, that what you were saying, if I now understand it, was that within a general category of denouncing violence or atrocities by military people against civilians, that Israel, in your opinion, was not separate from the rest of mankind, but was guilty of the same thing as others.
Of course, I don't think that Israelis are different from mankind. I'm not an anti-Semite to think they're not human. I mean,
I meant to the contrary.
Yes,
no, I meant to the contrary.
I know.
Professor, what I meant was this: that you do not. What you're saying is that you Israelis cannot claim to stand above the rest of mankind because what they've all done in time of war, even as self-defense, you have also done. Would that be correct, sir?
It's curious to me to defend the Germans and the Nazis of all people, because my country suffered in 2 wars of aggression by the Germans. But they too are human, and what the Nazis did is not peculiar. And not peculiar in the sense that the ambassador has explained that this unhappily is something that is in all human nature, and we have to break. Now, why I brought up the case of the Israelis in this connection was simply the practical fact that I was writing about the Palestine question and about the question between Jews and Gentiles in the world.
But it would apply to any other nation too.
And as the ambassador has quoted in other places in my book, I brought up cases in which I took my examples from the British and the French. And
I think from that point I could just say, if I may now in a more academic sense, I feel that in analyzing atrocities in history, there are gradations. I feel the Nazi onslaught, what they did, is something quite specific. Can it be compared to any other atrocity in human history? But you, sir, disagree. Now, in terms of I understand. But in terms of let's say the gradations of morality, how can I explain to you?
Yes.
Take the people in Israel who went through the hell, which were the Nazi death camps in Europe, the remnants.
Yes.
On coming out of those death camps, they tried to get to Israel, Palestine at the time, and many of them on ships were held up by the British Navy and arrested or sent over to Cyprus, put into camps.
Yes.
Now let's take a man on a ship like that. He had gone through the hell. He saw what the Nazis did to him. Now you'll be surprised, Professor, if you speak to these remnants today, although they felt at the time that the British attitude was one of cruelty and certainly political blindness. But they did not equate it with the Nazis. These same people who went through the Nazi experience, Holocaust, who escaped from it, their soul was not so shattered as to equate further evil as being at a Nazi level. And it is these same people, you say, who were so influenced by the Nazis that they did similar things to the Arabs. But I think that we can leave this point now with your permission, I think that the fact that you've set in the universal context shows it is a distinctive view of yours, that Israel is at one, or rather, if I may quote the point, that Israel is not separate from the rest of the nations of the world.
I don't think the Israelis are different from other human beings, yes, actually.
Well, and in other words, and the Nazi pal lies across the world. Before the Nazis came, this business of atrocity and cruelty, and after they've gone.